we are a little bit past the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Just in case you don't know who I am, I'm Maddie Kohler with NASEO. I am the NASEO person in the weeds on the rebates. And as per usual, thank you so much for taking so much time out of your week, especially the states who are meeting with me sometimes several times a week. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk about this important topic. In case you haven't already, please take a minute to introduce yourself in the chat. But we'll go ahead and dive right into the topic. As you can probably see from the slide on your screen now, we're going to be doing a deep dive on a Massachusetts program, a residential energy efficiency program. So I'm going to turn things over to Ian to take it away and do a presentation and lead a conversation. And as per usual, again, if folks have questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat throughout, and then we'll do discussion at the end. But Ian, please take it away. Thank you for being here, and thank you for sharing Massachusetts experience.
Yeah, no, thank you, Maddie, for the invitation. And just so everyone's aware, like Maddie set this up ages ago, and I just got her slides like 10 minutes ago, maybe 5 minutes ago. So she's very calm in the circumstances. So hi, everyone. I'm going to give you just a high-level overview of a program that we ran in Massachusetts that I think is quite relevant to some of the opportunities under the IRA funding. And right up front, a couple of shout outs. I want to give a shout out to Adam Stefanagle. I'm sure I'm still getting his name wrong after all these years. You'll see that we used their software in this program, and we thought it was great, as did the contractors. And then a couple of caveats. I don't think we're planning to use this exact program going forwards with the IRA funding. So I don't want folks to have that impression. It could be used, but one thing you'll see is, as a market rate program, we didn't really address like equity or serving underserved groups with this pilot program. And that is very much something that we'll be looking to do with the federal IRA dollars. And also, leveraging existing programs, of which we have a very robust program in Massachusetts. This program, as you'll see, was very much an alternative to the existing program. And so I don't think we would look to use federal money in the same way. Okay, let's dive in. Okay, so some background on the MVP program in Massachusetts. The intent here was to test a program that contractors really wanted at the time, using a pay-for-performance type approach. Pay-for-performance means different things to different people, so I'll get more into that later. And specifically, we wanted to test a bunch of things, including a different metric for how to count energy savings, the use of home energy scorecards, and we'll have more on that later, and the use of calibrated energy models as opposed to deemed savings models, which is what we had in MassSave at the time and still have in MassSave today. And to give you a sense of scope, we were looking to do about 400 to 600 homes with about 8 to 12 contractors over about a 3-year time period. So I'm going to jump to the conclusions, just so you have the context. This is a summary slide of the results. We'll have more in depth later. But essentially, we did meet pretty much all our goals. We ended up with 510 home renovations over a 3-year period. And we were pleasantly surprised by how much energy savings we got with this approach. An average of 54 MMBTUs a year. We used MMBTUs because there were savings on different heating fuels as a primary savings, and then obviously some electricity savings for some measures as well. But to translate that into real world, that was about a third of the energy use for these homes on average. So we were taking them from what they were using, taking a third of their energy away with these improvements. And to do that cost about $5 million. So just going to give you a bit more background now, and then we can get into the results in more depth. So if you really want the backstory on this pilot program, there is a 70-page or maybe 70 PowerPoint slide report that is on our website. I put the link up here. But essentially, we have a long-established weatherization program in Massachusetts called the NASEO Residential Coordinated Delivery Program. And every 3 years, we do a planning process to plan for the next 3-year plan. And we got a lot of public comment on the residential program leading up to the 2017 plan. And essentially what we found was that the contractor market was split. And this is a slide from the report. Kind of shows that we had a lot of what we call independent installation contractors, IICs, who were generally very satisfied with the program, but also a significant number of contractors who either were not participating in the program or were participating as what we call home performance or home improvement contractors, and they were not happy with the program at that time. Now, I'm pleased to say the NASEO program has evolved, and there's a much clearer and broader scope for these home improvement contractors now. But at the time, that was why we did this program. And this is a sense of the timeline for the program. So it started, kicked off back in 2017. It took a while to get going. We didn't provide any marketing funding for the program, and it was running alongside a long-established NASEO program, but you couldn't do both. You had to pick one or the other. So it took a while to get the first 50 projects. And then once word got out about this project, we saw a really big pickup in demand. So we, in the end, had to cut short enrollment in the program and end it early because there was a big increase in demand in 2020. And you may recall that COVID-19 was really hitting everybody in this industry at that time. So I think if it hadn't been for COVID-19, we would have seen an even faster acceleration in demand, and we would have run out of funds even sooner. So we definitely think this approach worked and maybe was too generous in our initial incentives. We unfortunately don't have ideal evaluation of the pilot. We did do a customer survey, which was very favorable. And we did try and collect pre and post utility data for all customers. But partly due to some technicalities, we weren't really able to use the utility data at the end. And then, as anyone who's worked with heating oil or propane would know, dealing with quantifying delivered fuels is really difficult. And we don't have any magic bullets for how to do that. So in terms of delivering the program itself, this was very much a contractor-driven model where home performance residential contractors were responsible for finding customers, marketing the program to customers, doing the work, and then reporting the results. Contractors were required to use the Snug Pro software and with some customization from Massachusetts, but not a lot, in order to get a baseline and calibrate the energy use in the home. and then also to generate a DOE home energy scorecard that we had also modified for Massachusetts, so that customers had a sense of where their home was performing relative to other homes before they started, and then after they implemented the scope of work. Now, in order to make this work, we needed a vendor to be very hands-on in managing these independent contractors. So we had a Clear Result, who's a national company doing the program management for us. And they were responsible for onboarding contractors, making sure they were qualified, doing the training, and then reviewing every single project for quality control, approval of scope before we put out incentives. We can get more into that if there are questions. This is how we structured the incentives. Essentially, to have that sort of performance-based approach, we were still using modeled savings rather than utility measured savings, but we were modeling against a calibrated baseline. So the Snug Pro software was used to get a baseline for the home in terms of the existing conditions in the home, the level of efficiency, and so on, but then calibrated to the past 12 or 18 months of utility bills or heating fuel information where that was available. And then for every MMBTU that you reduced from that baseline in the Snug Pro model, that's how you calculated the incentive. So this table on the right shows you that we started out with incentives between $125 and $160 an MMBTU. And then in the later phase, we really dropped that down to 85, but kept that higher level for envelope savings in order to encourage a combination of weatherization and heat pump conversions. And when you use this metric of MMBTUs saved, fuel switching from something like a 80 or 90% efficient fossil fuel piece of equipment to a heat pump with a COP of, in the range of 2.5 to 3.5 to up to 4 with some of the ground source heat pump projects that we had, that allows for really significant MMBTU savings. And so while we didn't specifically plan for this pilot to be an electrification pilot, by virtue of having that as our main metric, that's really what was motivating to contractors to do. So one of my key takeaways would be use site energy savings on an MMBTU basis if what you want is an electrification outcome from your program. Now, the way we conveyed that to customers and the way contractors convey that to customers was largely through talking about the measures that they were considering. And sometimes customers had specific measures in mind. But we also used this home energy scorecard. And this is the Massachusetts home energy scorecard, but the calculations underneath this come from the DOE home energy score. So if you're familiar with the DOE home energy score, that is a 1 to 10 scale, and it doesn't tell you explicitly what the total energy use is in MMBTUs. Because we wanted to use this MMBTU metric, we modified our scorecard to show that metric, and then customers could see exactly where they were beforehand, in this case 150, relative to the average home, and then where they were afterwards. And then the difference between the 150 and the 90 is how much of an incentive they're going to get. And we also show that in carbon terms using the greenhouse gas emissions factors for the different fuels in Massachusetts. But the primary metric was that MMBTUs one. And then on the back of the scorecard, the font here is a little small, but I want to draw your attention to the top right. That is the incentive that was offered for doing the full set of measures that that customers were selecting. So between the contractor and the customer, they decided, are we doing air sealing? Are we doing insulation? Are we doing a change in heating system? And the incentive based on this tiering encouraged customers to do more in the project in order to get to that higher level of savings. And that was quite effective in driving deeper projects and more energy savings than we anticipated. So this is a fairly representative project here where the customer incentive was about $8,250. And to translate that over to sort of an IRA implementation, that would be like combining the homes program and the electrification rebate program together to get to that kind of amount for a market rate customer. Okay, nearing the end here, but just to give you a bit more breakdown on what type of projects we saw and what kind of energy savings they produced. This sort of breaks it out by project type and by the primary fuel that the homes had to begin with. So you can see that the majority of projects used heat pumps as part of the project. And again, that wasn't something that we explicitly designed the pilot around, but it was a gap in the market in that MassSave wasn't really promoting heat pumps at that time, and certainly wasn't allowing heat pump conversions for natural gas customers at that time. There were also significant amounts of projects with weatherization, so a more direct alternative to the MassSave program. But most of those projects were not in MassSave covered territory. So in Massachusetts, we have 40 municipal utility communities. And so the majority of the weatherization only jobs were projects outside of MassSave territory where they had not had something like this available to them before. Whereas where we had a mix of heat pump and weatherization, that was more typically in MassSave territory where MassSave just wasn't offering a kind of coordinated delivery of insulation and electrification together. And then a couple of other slides. I have a slide on the assessment process, and then I also have a slide on the 0% interest loan, which we leveraged from the existing program structure but funded ourselves. So those are two other components. So I will stop there and then look forward to hearing any questions from the audience.
Thank you for that presentation. You did get a question, and I think this was in context of the scorecard. And the question is, are you assuming a fully weatherized home? Claudia, do you want to come off of mute and share more about the context of when you were asking this question?
Yes, thank you, Manny. Yeah, it is really because at the time that the calculation is made, the question is if those savings are taking consideration a fully weatherized home, because apparently in the next slides, weatherization was an option given to the customer, and was then the customer explained that those savings are calculated assuming that they will take up that option to weatherize. And if they did not weatherize, what would be those savings? So that's the question. Thank you, Maddie.
Yeah, so the way this program was run, the scope was decided by the contractor and the customer, and so it was entirely up to them, between them, whether to include weatherization work or not. And obviously that would be very dependent on the existing conditions in the home. I think the Snug Pro software does a good job of flagging the potential benefits of doing weatherization. So, and we trained contractors to, to emphasize the benefits of doing weatherization and heating system changes together and jointly. But that wasn't always the case. We had some contractors who were just weatherization contractors and would sometimes sub for let's say a heat pump or mini split provider. We had some contractors who were just heat pump specialists and weren't interested in doing weatherization work. On the specific example we're showing here on this scorecard, my guess is this project did do both weatherization and probably a heat pump change from a different fuel, because we see quite a big change in both the carbon footprint. So maybe, and we can see that it was a fuel oil heated home. So I'm guessing they replaced the fuel oil heating system with a heat pump. But I don't know that they did any weatherization or not. It's kind of hard to tell.
Okay.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you. And Maddie, if I can follow on with a second question quick.
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Thank you. In your slide where you discussed the residential contractors split on support for Mass Save, would you be able to share some of the concerns that contractors identified and challenges, the ones that were not so happy with the program?
Yeah, so for that, I would send you to this report and at this link posted on the slide. In that report, there are the results or a summary of the results of a contractor survey that we ran.
Oh, great.
So you can see, and like I want to stress that the Mass Save program has evolved since that time. So the utilities that implement the Mass Save program were participants in this contractor working group, and I do think it did influence some of the subsequent program changes.
Thank you.
The next question you have in the chat is if you have any information about who took advantage of the 0% loan offering and whether or not contractors found that useful.
Yeah, great question. So in Massachusetts, we have had for a long time a zero interest loan program that was set up maybe as much as 20 years ago. And we have a lot of local banks and credit unions that participate in that program. So we felt that when we had an alternative to Mass Save being offered, that we had to offer the equivalent 0% loan in order for it to be an apples to apples comparison within Massachusetts. So essentially our energy office subsidized the interest payments on these loans so that customers would see a 0% interest loan in the same way that Mass Save does that now. So if people are interested in that model, it's a very mature program in Massachusetts, and we'd be happy to talk about it. In terms of this pilot, I forget the exact numbers, but it was a significant percentage. I'm just going to look for that in another document here, but I think it was a high. I want to say at least a third of customers used that. Oh, here it is. So we had 272. So a little bit more than 50% of the households in the program used the zero interest loan option. And there's a little bit of paperwork involved. You have to get approved by a lender, but obviously paying for this kind of work with zero interest is highly attractive.
Thank you. And The next question we have is a question about whether or not, if you have information on the cost savings and whether or not they were strong as the energy savings.
Yep. I don't have that in the slides for you today. Maybe I'll go back to some of the energy savings numbers here. But what we found is that was very dependent on the existing fuel being used. So you'll see down here in the primary fuel that there were a lot of fuel oil customers. That was the largest group of customers. And they were, in a switching from fuel oil to a cold climate heat pump, they were going to save a lot on their energy use. The next most common users were natural gas customers. And particularly in the Massachusetts market, where natural gas is relatively cheap on an MMBTU basis and electricity is relatively expensive by US standards, they were not necessarily going to save anything on their energy bill. Although if they did weatherization and cold climate heat pumps, then they were showing really significant reductions in energy use. So I suspect they probably had some utility cost savings, but it wouldn't be significant, and clearly wasn't what was motivating these customers. I think it was more concern about natural gas and desire for heat pumps that was motivating those projects.
Real quick, I would say that's pretty much right on. What I remember seeing a lot is that the weatherization work really did bring the costs down a lot, so that it pretty much made up for the extra cost of the heat pump with that expensive electricity and fairly cheap natural gas for those types of projects. So pretty much correct there.
Yeah, and Adam, do you want to say a little bit about your role, your company's role in this?
Sure. Yeah. So, Snug Pro was chosen in partnership with Clear Result to administer this program, and a huge part of this is really like modeling the real experience, the exact home itself, using the BPI 2400 calibration that Snug Pro provides, dialing in that base home, and then getting really good, accurate numbers on the improvement side, especially because it's, you're actually rebating against that. And so anywhere you're calculating a savings percentage and building your rebate based on that percentage, the utility bill calibration is just such an important piece. And we were able to do, you're still, even with the delivery fuels, we were able to get enough information to get a decent calibration, something that dials in the project to make sure that it's not completely overestimating or really off in any sort of way. But in all of this, it was able to give the transparency necessary to the consumer to know, well, your bills are going to go down a little bit, but not nearly as much as, the total cost of the project might make up for, giving people that real transparency to see. Now, of course, with delivery fuels, they're going to save a ton because of the way that the commodities prices were at that point in time. So yeah, it was great. We had a lot of positive feedback from the contractors using the software and doing the actual work. They were able to get some huge incentives because of it. So yeah, so far got a lot of good feedback from it.
Yeah, and I'm just showing the front page of the scorecard again, and you can see in the bottom left, the Snug Pro model was showing the annual energy costs before and after and calculating savings. And we were part of a NASEO supported program several years before this, where we looked at some of the different metrics that you could use along with other states. And our conclusion from that was that using cost savings, while on face value might sound appealing, is actually a really bad idea for these kind of programs. Partly that's because of the volatility in fuel prices, but also, like, if your goal is to address long-term energy needs, and if you're concerned at all about greenhouse gas emissions, then using dollars or costs as your primary metric is not going to align well with those policy goals. So that's, again, another reason why we chose MMBTUs per year as our metric. We could have chosen tons of carbon, and that felt too abstract and has its own issues related to like changing fuel mixes and so on the grid. So, I mean, we went with this metric, and I think it was borne out in the results that it was a successful metric to use for our policy goals. So I think for your state or jurisdiction, that's something that's worth really thinking carefully about. And if someone says, yeah, just use cost savings, then I suspect they haven't really thought about what they're trying to achieve.
Rupert, I see you have your hand up. Let's go over to you.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Maddie, and thank you, Ian, for the presentation. This is Rupa Deshmukh from New Jersey BPU. Actually, what you just said really segues well into my question on, what is it's related to, a really good solid metric to you that we could use for basing our incentives off of. And one concern, and I guess one discussion that we are having in our state is whether to, first of all, whether it should be MMBTU versus tons. Or million metric tons, and then the other is consideration is whether to use site source energy in our calculations and derivations. So to your point, I was just kind of noting down your point for like using metric tons and the complexities. Yes, due to the fuel mix. But can you also speak to the what are the other issues using source energy in the incentive structures? Thank you.
Yeah, so again, I want to reference an earlier report that NASEO sponsored that looked at home energy scorecards and all of the different potential metrics, primary and secondary metrics. That was probably, 5 years ago that NASEO put that report out. I forget exactly what it's titled. We can probably share that around later. There were multiple state perspectives on that. So there wasn't necessarily this is what you should do. It was sort of, these are the pros and cons of different metrics. I would say that we thought this was a good metric going into the pilot, and it really reinforced our thinking that it was a good metric after the pilot. We're planning to use this scorecard for our mass save program that's in the process of being rolled out in the next year or so statewide. We also use it for new construction projects. We use it in the municipal utility territories in our state. And when I say this metric, we use site MMBTU per year, not source. I think there was a time when source MMBTU was in favor. Maybe that's still the case for a few people at EPA. But if you're trying to communicate to a customer about their house, then site MMBTU is much more intuitive, because you can sort of explain that, that MMBTU metric comes from a simple calculation of like how many gallons of fuel oil or how many therms of gas did you use, and then how many kilowatt hours are on your electric bill for whether you have an electric dryer or just you're running lights and appliances or you have a heat pump. Doing it in a site basis is, I think, more transparent. And if you go to source energy is basically the same idea as using carbon emissions in tons. You have to have a conversion factor, and that conversion factor should change over time because your electric grid is not going to be static. So unlike greenhouse gas tons, which has sort of real meaning to people, source energy doesn't actually represent anything in the real world that your average household can relate to. It can be a helpful concept, but it's not very tangible. So yeah, so we did do some consumer focus groups very early on in this process before an even earlier pilot program where we settled on using site energy rather than source energy. And then this is actually our second pilot program where we used that metric. So if folks want to have a more detailed conversation on this, we could follow up offline. And I suspect there are other opinions on this. So I don't want to suggest that this is the only choice, but it was a very strong one for us.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Ian. Yeah, I may have a follow-up conversation with you offline, but on this couple of follow-up questions.
And I see that David Heslin, who's also an expert in this area, put the NASEO report that I was referencing on the different metrics that you can use in the chat. I guess the Empress report. How I could forget that acronym, I don't know.
If I can take moderator's prerogative and ask a question of my own, Ian, it would be if you can share with us what parts of this structure you're considering implementing for the rebates program, or if you want to take it a wider scope, if there's any pieces of the structure that you think other state energy offices should be considering.
Yeah. So, I mean, I made sure I made that caveat at the start that this is not the program that we're going to use. There are a lot of aspects of this that we would be very happy to use. I think, you know, the Snug Pro software, and perhaps there are others, but that do have calibrated utility energy use as a function. That was a big win for us, I think. And just to give you some context on that, the alternative, the MassSave audit software that was being used at the time, and there's some differences in the software now, but the same general concern applies, that's not calibrated to utility usage. We've evaluated that twice in my memory, and both times it's shown that estimated savings are off by in the order of, say, 20% above what the real world findings are. So if you're not using calibrated audit software, I think you're overestimating the savings. And that may or may not matter to you, but we felt like the credibility with customers that they would get the results that they were expecting was strengthened by using calibrated software. So definitely would continue to do that. As I've already said, I think we'll continue to use this style of scorecard with the site MMB2 metric, but also showing cost savings and greenhouse gases. I think that helps inform customers who have different motivations for wanting to do this work. And for market rate customers in particular, I think maybe driving well, I mean, with the federal money, you've got a little bit of flexibility, but trying to align the savings with going deeper and doing more work, I think we'd like to do that too. But beyond that, we really haven't had that policy discussion on how exactly to design the program, or even what markets to target. So if you were going to prioritize, say, multifamily rental properties, then I'm not sure we could use the same tools to assess those. But there are strong equity reasons to consider targeting multifamily rental properties.
Do we have any other questions for Ian from the audience? Feel free to raise your hand or to add it in the chat. If not, Ian, are there any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
I think I've taken enough of everyone's time. I do think we learned a lot from doing this, and obviously everybody's territory is different, but I think that the intent of sharing this is so that you don't have to spend as much time and head scratching as we did to decide how to make some of these decisions. So yeah, if folks want more background on it, we're happy to provide it. And best of luck to everybody. It's going to be challenging, I think, to use these federal funds to the best effect.
And if anyone would like to do that follow-up with Ian, I'm happy to be the facilitator on that. If you'd like, just send me a note and I'm happy to make an introduction. Well, I haven't seen any new questions come in, so I guess we will wrap things up for the day. Ian, thank you so much for taking the time to present with us this afternoon. Folks, we've got Elevate Energy, or excuse me, they just go by Elevate now, lined up for next week to talk about their work engaging with underserved populations in order to get them interested in energy efficiency projects. So hopefully I will see you all next week. And in the meantime, have a good one. Please be in touch with anything that might come up. Talk to you all later.
Thank you.